Stalin opens his eyes on March 8, 1953, and the world that thought it was free remains in chains. 3 days earlier, guards at the Kuntsevo dacha found the 74-year-old dictator collapsed on his bedroom floor, soaked in his own urine, unable to speak. For hours, no one dared enter without permission. For hours more, terrified officials debated whether to summon doctors, the very profession Stalin had denounced as murderers and poisoners just weeks before. The doctors' plot, announced in January, had accused predominantly Jewish physicians of conspiring to assassinate Soviet leaders. Stalin's personal physician, Vladimir Vinogradov, sat in a prison cell, his hands broken by interrogators, and now the man who put him there lay dying, and no one knew whom to call. But someone acted. A junior surgeon at the Kremlin hospital, his name later erased from records, performed emergency cranial surgery to drain the hemorrhaged blood and reduce the swelling crushing Stalin's brain. It was desperate, it was against every protocol, and it worked. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. What no one understood that morning, what would take years to become clear, was that saving Stalin's life would cost more lives than letting him die. By April, Stalin could speak again, though his words came slowly, slurred. The left side of his face frozen in a permanent half-grimace. He could walk with assistance, he could sign documents, and he could remember. The first order he gave from his sickbed was to Lavrenti Beria, head of the security services, the man who had stood over Stalin's unconscious body and reportedly said he was done for. Stalin remembered who had hesitated. Stalin always remembered the doctor's plot, which in our history died with its creator, now metastasized. If Jewish physicians had tried to kill Soviet leaders, Stalin reasoned, then the conspiracy must run deeper than anyone imagined. His own collapse proved it. Someone had gotten to him despite all precautions. The search for conspirators expanded from Moscow's elite hospitals to every medical facility in the Soviet Union. Within weeks, hundreds of physicians, nurses, and hospital administrators were arrested. The charges varied: sabotage, poisoning, espionage for American intelligence, but the outcome was always the same: confessions extracted under torture, show trials prepared, families deported to Kazakhstan. The medical system that had just saved Stalin's life began to collapse under suspicion, as doctors refused to treat high-ranking patients for fear of being blamed when anyone died. The Purge needed a name. It would come to be called the White Coat Terror. Stalin's brush with death had not softened him. It had clarified his thinking. He had nearly died, and his closest comrades had stood around debating while his brain swelled. They had hesitated, they had calculated, they had hoped. Vyacheslav Molotov, the old Bolshevik who had served Stalin for 3 decades, was arrested in June 1953 on charges of conspiring with Western intelligence. His wife was already in a labor camp. Now he joined her, though they would never meet again. Georgy Malenkov, who had been Stalin's presumed heir, was demoted with brutal simplicity, sent to manage a hydroelectric station in Kazakhstan, his name removed from photographs, his apartments in Moscow given to strangers. Nikita Khrushchev survived. He survived by denouncing colleagues before they could denounce him, by feeding Stalin names, by becoming indispensable to the Purge machinery, even as he privately despised it. This was how one lived in Stalin's court. This was how one always had. But Khrushchev would remember every name he gave, every friend he sacrificed, and he would wonder, in the years to come, whether he had simply postponed his own execution or guaranteed it. On June 17, 1953, workers in East Berlin took to the streets demanding better conditions, free elections, the removal of the regime. Soviet tanks crushed the uprising within days. This happened in our timeline too. But in this timeline, Stalin was watching. The East German rebellion should not have been possible. It suggested failure at every level: the party, the security services, the occupation forces. Someone had to answer for it. Walter Ulbricht, the East German leader, kept his position only by offering names: reformists, moderates, anyone who had suggested relaxing controls. In Poland, the security services arrested 200 party members preemptively before any uprising could occur. In Hungary, similar sweeps targeted anyone associated with the executed Laszlo Rajk, whose show trial in 1949 now provided a template for new prosecutions. The pattern spread across the bloc. Arrest the reformers before they reform, eliminate the moderates before they moderate. But purges create martyrs. Names whispered in prison cells became symbols. The tighter Stalin gripped, the more the cracks spread beneath the surface. This is the part of the story no one saw coming, including Stalin himself. In Washington, the Eisenhower administration had initially hoped that Stalin's survival might paradoxically enable negotiation. A weakened dictator might seek accommodation. A leader facing mortality might want legacy over confrontation. They were wrong. The Korean armistice, signed in July 1953, held neither side wanted renewed war, but every other diplomatic channel froze. American overtures were rebuffed. British attempts at contact went unanswered. When a Geneva conference convened to discuss European security, the Soviet delegation walked out on the second day, denouncing the proceedings as an American trap. Inside the CIA, analysts debated what Stalin's survival meant for the long term. Some argued the purges would weaken Soviet capabilities. Others noted that terror had only strengthened Stalin's grip before. During the Great Purge of the 1930s, he had eliminated his rivals and emerged more powerful than ever. The consensus, delivered to Eisenhower in a classified estimate, was grim. Prepare for a decade of confrontation. Stalin would die eventually, but until then the Cold War would only grow colder. Lavrenti Beria had done everything Stalin asked. He had expanded the arrests, supervised the interrogations, managed the deportations. He had made himself indispensable to the terror. And that was precisely the problem. Stalin understood power. He understood that anyone who accumulated too much of it became dangerous. Beria knew too much. Beria had too many files, too many secrets, too many loyal men in the security apparatus. Beria had seen Stalin weak and helpless on the floor of his dacha. In February 1954, Beria was summoned to a Politburo meeting and arrested by military officers before he could reach his seat. The charges were espionage, treason, and moral degeneracy, the last referring to his documented predation on young women, crimes everyone had known about and no one had mentioned while he remained useful. Beria was shot in a basement, just as he would have been in our timeline. Just a year later, his family was exiled. His name was erased from encyclopedias. The man who had overseen the deaths of hundreds of thousands became, officially, a non-person. But the apparatus he had built remained, and it now answered directly to Stalin. By 1955, Stalin was 76 years old and failing again. The surgery that saved his life had not reversed his age. Small strokes accumulated. His memory faltered. His paranoia deepened into something beyond calculation, a constant grinding fear that infected every decision. He ruled from his dacha now, rarely appearing in public, issuing orders through written notes that his secretaries transcribed and distributed. The system he had built required his constant attention, his endless suspicion, his signature on every significant document. Without that attention, it began to seize. Economic targets were missed. Agricultural output fell as collective farm managers, afraid to report bad news, sent falsified reports up the chain. Industrial accidents increased as engineers, afraid to admit problems, let equipment fail rather than request repairs that might draw scrutiny. The Soviet Union was not collapsing. It was calcifying, hardening into a structure that could not adapt, because adaptation required honesty, and honesty had become fatal. On December 21, 1955, Stalin's official birthday, though records suggest he was actually born in 1878, the dictator suffered a second massive cerebral hemorrhage. This time, the guards entered his room sooner. This time, doctors were summoned immediately. But no one operated. No junior surgeon stepped forward to attempt a desperate intervention. The physicians who remained after 2 years of purges understood the calculation clearly. If they tried to save him and failed, they would be executed for murder. If they tried and succeeded, they might be executed anyway for knowing too much about his condition. The safest course was to provide comfort care and let nature take its course. Stalin died on December 23, 1955. He was conscious briefly before the end, able to recognize faces, unable to speak. What he thought in those final hours, whether he understood that his own terror had ensured no one would save him this time, no one can know. The succession crisis that followed was bloodier than it would have been in 1953. The moderate voices, Malenkov, Molotov, others who might have counseled restraint, had been purged or broken. Only hardliners remained, and hardliners do not negotiate. They fight until one faction stands alone. In our timeline, Stalin died on March 5, 1953, and his successors eventually began a slow thaw, a careful dismantling of the worst excesses of his rule. Khrushchev's secret speech in 1956 denounced Stalin's crimes. The Gulag population slowly decreased. The terror receded, though it never fully disappeared. In this other history, the thaw came later and more violently, after another round of purges, after more millions of lives disrupted or destroyed. The Soviet system survived. It always survived, but the scar tissue accumulated, hardening into a rigidity that would make eventual collapse more sudden and more chaotic. Sometimes a tyrant dies, and his system softens. Sometimes a tyrant lives, and his system becomes a monument to his pathology. History is contingent. A junior surgeon's decision on a cold March morning could reshape the fates of millions who would never know his name. That is the weight of small moments. That is why the study of what might have been illuminates what actually was.